Whoever you are, you have heard of Bandai. The company has lasted for generations, producing toys and merchandise under its brand, planting itself firmly in the grounds of popular culture with brands and products that a heck of a lot of people can recognize. They are one of many success stories of Japan's economic miracle, making its mark as one of the largest toy companies in the world. So you'd probably be surprised to hear that their entrance into the video game market was not that smooth. Much like Bandai, a lot of major names in the industry started in different fields. Sega made amusement machines before pivoting to video arcade games. Sony had a strong reputation in tech and incorporated their expertise into the PlayStation, and Nintendo in particular managed to successfully pivot from toys to games by deciding that games are the new toys. Bandai probably could have done the same thing and gotten away with it, but attempts like the Supervision 8000 or the RX-78 microcomputer never met the same kind of success as the Famicom, meeting the same fate of so many fallen competitors. The company may have gotten nowhere with video game hardware, but it inevitably joined in on publishing games for Nintendo's console, demonstrating their power as a licensor for gigantic brands like Gundam, Kamen Rider, Ultraman, and Shonen Jump. Even if Bandai didn't have its own monopolistic platform, it supplied the market with kinda cheap Famicom games, mostly developed by the besties at Tensei. This continued on subsequent consoles and sorta hasn't stopped since, allowing Bandai to enjoy its own piece of the industry. As the 1990s continued, economic and cultural shifts rapidly affected the state of technology in video games, so we ended up with an all-out CD-ROM war in the middle of the decade that led to numerous tech companies throwing their own resources into the void to hopefully overtake existing game companies as the new number one. Sony inherited that number one title with the PlayStation, but along the way we got stuff like the Pippin. Considering Bandai's whole thing was toys and exclusive brand merch, you'd think they'd be content without dedicated game hardware, but they kept trying, and this time they used technology licensed out by Apple that essentially crammed a Mac into a little box for the TV. It was kinda like the FM Towns Marty. Though hastily executed, it's remarkably ahead of its time, attempting to make the computer consumer experience more accessible by offering multimedia CD games and the worldwide web, but Bandai likely weren't prepared for what they had on their hands and didn't really do much with it. The kinds of multimedia CD games available for Pippin surprisingly include Gadget, Invention, Travel and Adventure, Super Marathon, Dazzleoids, Nobunaga's Ambition Returns, and Yellow Brick Road, making it a unique way to play a specific handful of high-quality games. Perhaps most significantly, it was home to the first piece of software developed by Masaya Matsuda, Chunin Glue. He already had Mac experience after producing The Seven Colors, a multimedia project based on his band that you absolutely must check out, but it wasn't long after that he found success designing games for Sony's PlayStation. The Pippin was a moderate failure, commonly referred to as a flop on Apple's part, yet it was possibly the most important of Bandai's hardware experiments before the company actually hunkered down and started taking things seriously. Whoever you are, Nintendo. You have heard of Nintendo. The behemoth's identity as we know it stemmed in part from Gunpei Yokoi's contributions as a game designer, from toys to the Game & Watch and Game Boy, on top of having a hand in numerous seminal Nintendo games. Donkey Kong, Mario Brothers, Famicom Detective Club, Metroid, Fire Emblem, Miho Nakayama no Tokimeki High School. He's our guy this time round. After designing the overambitious Virtual Boy and the not particularly ambitious Game Boy Pocket, Yokoi departed from the company in 1996 for whatever personal reasons. Rather than retiring, he founded Koto Laboratories, so he could continue designing handheld games in the vein of his past work. With them, he oversaw the release of 2 LCD keychain handhelds distributed by a company named Hiro, Connect Connectio, a variation on Snake, and Heno Heno, a puzzle game where you arrange and eliminate lines on a grid. Koto was additionally tasked with designing a Game Boy rival, which Gunpei Yokoi was naturally involved in, to provide his renowned and profitable design philosophy that effectively combined the abstract worlds of toy and computer. However, only a year after Koto was established, Yokoi suddenly and unfortunately passed away after a tragic car accident. He left us too soon to see the release of his final product, the Bandai WonderSwan. Bandai, still embracing the heat of their explosive Tamagotchi LCD virtual pet line, came to the newly established Koto with the intentions of manufacturing a rival to the Game Boy. In 1996, Nintendo's handheld had lost some steam, and it was time for a successor, whether from Nintendo itself or a new competitor. The Game Boy absolutely dwarfed any competition for its cost-conscious hardware design and strong library of games, while the competition in question tended to shoot for more ambitious power over practical efficiency. But after a few too many years, there was more than enough space for something to succeed in. That successor was supposed to be the Virtual Boy, but that famously didn't go to plan, so they were back at square one for the time being. Hold on, do you hear that? Bandai saw the opportunity in front of them and wanted their own Game Boy killer, borrowing Yokoi's expertise in the hopes that it would directly combat Nintendo. And so the WonderSwan was made, with the same cost-effective methods that made the Game Boy easy to manufacture. After past failures with console hardware, Bandai's decision to produce such a handheld was evidently carefully considered and suited their usual target demo pretty strongly. It seems like Bandai genuinely wanted to get the whole video game thing right for once. Even outside of this project, the company actually planned to merge with Sega, a deal that could have resulted in a harmonic powerhouse of toys and games, but fell through around May 1997. Later that year, Bandai would reveal the WonderSwan to the public, and nothing could possibly go wrong from here. The microphone isn't picking up that noise, right? What is that? Over in the console market, things have been shaken up all over the place. Nintendo were so stubborn about continuing to use cartridges for the N64 that it burnt bridges with major developers eager to take advantage of CD storage, so while the PlayStation was the newly designated good boy, the former monopolizer struggled hard. Nintendo's strength in the handheld market was beginning to wane too, so something like the WonderSwan could have thwarted said monopoly once and for all, but in 1996, a game called Pocket Monsters for Game Boy launched, meeting mild sales numbers, a result of its awkward February release combined with the fading relevance of the Game Boy itself. But through word of mouth, continuous magazine coverage, and its unique link trading system, it gained prominence in Japan. The popularity of Pocket Monsters gradually but certainly swelled up, and it exploded once Nintendo began localizing and distributing the franchise globally in 1998 under the abbreviated name Pokémon. Whoever you are, you know what Pokemon is. While it seemed like the Game Boy was in its final years, Pokémon was the shot in the arm it needed to keep going for years more, which meant that it was a huge problem for Bandai. On top of Game Boy's resurgence, the WonderSwan never got released outside of Asia, meaning it's a largely overlooked platform with an untranslated library. So, of course, I want to talk about the WonderSwan, but importantly, I want to talk about its games. While there isn't a huge, crazy Game Boy-type bottomless pit of who knows what, there's about 200 official WonderSwan games in total, and many of those are actually pretty good, or at least interesting enough for the time that it's worth discussing. The games I'm going to cover here are those I found the most noteworthy after trying out at least a couple dozen of them, but I'll discuss them in the context of their place in WonderSwan history, starting with the WonderSwan itself launched on March 4th, 1999, after much time was spent developing and preparing it. This release came long after the competing Game Boy Color, an immediate blow against Bandai for its color screen, but the WonderSwan still had the advantage of its own original software. Its launch lineup included Koto's own Gunpei, a puzzle game designed to parallel the intuitive nature of something like Game Boy's Tetris. Gunpei was originally designed by Yokoi himself. Those LCD games I mentioned earlier that Koto released before the WonderSwan is where this game originates. Though before it was named Heno Heno, its WonderSwan incarnation was specially designed for the hardware and it was renamed in honor of its creator. Like Tetris, you need to eliminate lines, but instead of lines of blocks you must arrange a set of tiles to create and eliminate a line that connects to each side. It was kinda hard to grasp at first, but after a few rounds I realized this game is satisfying as hell. If you give it to me, I may be stuck playing it for hours. It is honestly poisonous how addicting this game is. You might have noticed that the game is vertical rather than horizontal, and this is part of the WonderSwan's whole deal. About a decade before smartphones entered the scene, and about a decade after, the Atari Lynx did pretty much the same thing. The WonderSwan offered two orientations to suit any given game. Gunpei is in vertical mode, but I'm about to switch to horizontal mode for another launch title.
電車で GO!
One major defining trait of the WonderSwan is the surprising amount of third-party support. There was no messing around here, no Pippin-esque shortcomings, and on launch day alone the platform saw some big names retreat primarily because Bandai Bandai has money. Most shockingly, Square licensed the Final Fantasy spin-off Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon, the company's first handheld release after falling out with Nintendo. As part of the Mystery Dungeon series, Chunsoft's rogue-esque RPG franchise, which began with a Dragon Quest spin-off, this appears like an attempt to capture several audiences in one go. Alongside it, though, came a lucrative port of Taito's latest arcade hit, Densha de Go, proving the WonderSwan's capability to kinda, sorta, almost do 3D-ish graphics a little bit if you squint your eyes. Densha de Go is what happens when you mix train simulation with arcade gameplay, a crushingly precise challenge designed with state-of-the-art graphics and an accurate train controller for full immersion. It's the result of a Taito dev who is just really normal about trains, and because of its dedicated accuracy, it became one of Japan's most popular arcade games in the late 90s. While arcades in general had begun to die out in favor of home entertainment, games like Densha de Go continued to innovate, proving that the arcade scene wouldn't die just yet. With success came home ports, as well as another of those Hero LCD games, so naturally the game was gonna come to handhelds too. Before Nintendo ever got a slice of Densha de Go, the WonderSwan received a day one port of the game, and it's a little mangled, I'll be real. This port is just an approximation of what Densha de Go is like, doing its best despite the odds, and I guess it's all you really need for a pocket-size alternative. It seems like more than a few arcade ports that did appear on the handheld weren't as good as they could have been, like the impossible to fumble Space Invaders, which got ported by Sunsoft, who confusingly didn't take advantage of the vertical aspect ratio. For what it's worth, Densha de Go does the best it can on hardware it wasn't meant for. The exact same can be said for the next game I'm looking at. While Densha de Go did shake up Japanese game censors, the more prevalent trend of the era was rhythm gameplay. The genre was inevitable, with games everywhere adopting high-quality audio for such a musical focus to be feasible, and after Masaya Matsura's PaRappa the Rapper back in 1996, these things blew up fast. 1999 was the year Konami Dance revolted around the world, following up on earlier output by their specialist rhythm game division, Bemani. The division's namesake, Beatmania, kickstarted the arcade rhythm boom and got popular enough to receive a bunch of sequels and ports and expansions and peripherals, so naturally it was ported to a handheld with substandard audio capabilities. The only Konami game for WonderSwan, Beatmania surprisingly manages to work here. The game was carefully fitted for the hardware, making use of the vertical display and sample-based audio, so it's not struggling functionally as much as Denshide Go. That considered, I suck at this game in general, so I couldn't tell you if it plays the greatest. The unusual button layout doesn't help either, though the game originally came with this funky attachment to give it more of that arcade feel. I couldn't tell you how effective this is, but it's yet more evidence of how adaptive the WonderSwan's design can be. Support from Taito and Konami was very limited on WonderSwan, and the pattern followed with Namco, whose expertise helped push Sony's PlayStation as the real deal just a few years prior. With how that worked out, it would make sense if Bandai did the same and got them on board for WonderSwan, and I mean, this worked a little bit. Namco's first WonderSwan game is a follow-up to Klonoa, the 2.5D platformer that every furry will tell you is the best PS1 game. Before receiving a direct sequel in 2001, Klonoa made its handheld debut with Moonlight Museum, making for the WonderSwan's first platformer. Klonoa on PS1 is a pretty slow-paced explorative puzzle platformer, so Moonlight Museum takes that same approach, with each level being structured kinda like a mini dungeon, where keys are necessary to progress. The game makes use of the WonderSwan's tiltability too, where by default it's horizontal, but then some levels are vertical to fit taller level layouts. I'm not huge on the gameplay here, but the visuals, like these little cutscene illustrations, are really nice to look at. It's worth adding that this is the first game here with an English translation. Unofficially, of course, but it's one of the few games on the whole platform to be patched by fans. Another of those few being While this isn't the WonderSwan's first brand tie-in game, it was just beat out by Gundam a few months prior, it is the first handheld Evangelion game. Being one of the freshest brands for Bandai at the time, it makes sense that they'd cram it on here, as the series got more than a few tie-in games at the time. This includes several Sega Saturn games, a PlayStation Mahjong game, an N64 fighting game, a typing series, and even more beyond the WonderSwan. Believe it or not, Shito Ikuse is one of the few Evangelion games with a fan translation, as far as I'm aware. As is Bandai's territory, it's a Tamagotchi-type pet simulation in which you raise a fetus. This is my creature, his name is Bappy, and I've been tasked with taking care of him as he grows into a beautiful angel. While making sure he doesn't die, I can hang around Nerve HQ, and according to the untranslated guide, I can even apparently go outside if certain conditions are met, I guess. So there's enough added to the pet sim stuff that turns this into a sort of RPG. My beautiful child Babby grew into this big diamond thing, and immediately got its ass kicked by Ayanami, but you know, it's the journey, it's not the destination. After only a few hours, the game ends, and Asuka shows up to tell you your actual completion rate. The goal is to repeatedly raise little guys until you get them all, I suppose, and the guide shows that this includes Kaworu, so you can in fact grow him like a Tamagotchi in this game. Yeah. Throughout the rest of the year, the WonderSwan kept getting more games to bulk up its library, solidifying itself with unusual ports and suitable original titles. It was kinda like the FM Towns Marty. If I had more time on my hands, I'd go over every game to paint a fuller picture, but unfortunately I'm not Quantando. This video isn't called WonderSwan. I'm sorry to let you down. That said though, there are some more 1999 releases I'd like to quickly go over. Around the launch period, WonderSwan got a Mega Man and Bass sequel, which, depending on your definition, predates Klonoa as the first platformer on WonderSwan, but neither game is all that fast-paced. There's also a Puyo Puyo port that's unplayable because why would you ever play Puyo Puyo without color, and an eager port of Nobunaga's Ambition, Koei's long-standing strategy series that began on computers but ended up getting crammed onto everything. It was on the Pippin. This is familiar even for Bandai. Later down the line, we got a Tekken card RPG, an action game from Koto Labs, and more arcade ports like Puzzle Bobble and Crazy Climber. Capcom's Ghosts and Goblins also made its handheld debut here on WonderSwan in the summer of 1999, which I'll never forget to remind you has the comically badass name Makaimura in Japan. The thing you've got to understand about this point in game history is that things moved intensely quickly. By autumn the next console generation was underway, Sony revealed the PS2 and the Dreamcast had launched globally, and it seems like the handheld market moved twice as fast. Nintendo announced the production of their 32-bit Game Boy successor, meanwhile SNK discontinued their Neo Geo Pocket in Japan only to launch the Neo Geo Pocket Color worldwide. Meanwhile, Disney's live-action Inspector Gadget movie released in theater. Meanwhile, the second generation of Pokemon launched in Japan, and through all of this, WonderSwan games wouldn't stop coming out. On the market, it didn't do so badly, meeting success with particular audiences. A little after launch, retailers claimed that most WonderSwan owners were salarymen in their 20s, and that the small, lightweight design made it popular with women, too. WonderSwan happened to arrive during an unprecedented handheld gaming boom, a trend massive enough that it was even capitalized upon by Sony when they released the Pocket Station a little earlier in January 1999. Rather than competing in the same field as the Game Boy and WonderSwan, it was more like a Tamagotchi that connected to the PS1 as a memory card that can send and receive data in certain games, a little like the Dreamcast's VMU. It's maybe most notable for introducing the Dokodemo Isho series, but it's got a shocking amount of support for other games released around the same time, including stuff from Bandai. And so I'm not really sure how this collaboration came about, but Bandai and Sony had some kind of half-partnership that spiritually made the WonderSwan the PlayStation handheld of its time. This comes across in retrospect like Sony just wanted to spite Nintendo even further, though it was probably just lucrative for Bandai to lean on the brand in this way. Much of WonderSwan's third-party support paralleled the sort of thing you'd see on PlayStation, which I'll go into a little more later, but even the platform-defining Gunpei got a PS1 port in late 1999. Eventually this resulted in direct compatibility between PlayStation and WonderSwan when Bandai put out the Wonder Wave sometime in 2000, an accessory built solely to communicate with the Pocket Station for data transfer between Bandai games. From what I can find, it was mainly compatible with Digimon games, which is its whole own thing to go into, but that franchise did make its portable debut here on WonderSwan. Digimon itself originated as a virtual pet franchise spun off from Tamagotchi, so really this all comes full circle, but I've gotta wonder who was buying a WonderSwan, and a PlayStation, and a Pocket Station, and a Wonder Wave, and exclusive Digimon games for both platforms, when the pet LCD toys were right there. If you wanted to know just how saturated the handheld market was at the time, this is it. Taking the handheld boom into account, the WonderSwan's library demonstrates a pretty good slice of the kinds of games popular in Japan around this time. A variety of genres and series shoved onto a tiny screen that had a little more room than the Game Boy. Throughout the next year, there were more games releasing, though things certainly slowed down once 2000 came around for a simple reason. Bandai were already preparing the color upgrade for the WonderSwan, set to release by the end of the year, so focus quickly shifted away from monochrome games, leaving the release schedule this year pretty dry. Not that there's nothing to cover, but only a handful more, like proving further that the WonderSwan ain't your daddy's Game Boy. It got a handful of horror titles. Firstly, a port of Clock Tower in December 1999, which is the only handheld release in that series. This was followed up months later by 2 whole games based on Junji Ito's Uzumaki manga. I'm gonna say it again very slowly. The WonderSwan, in 2000, received 2 official games based on Uzumaki by Junji Ito. These are, by all accounts, the only games ever made based on any of Junji Ito's work, unless you count those influenced by it, like World of Horror. It's pretty shocking that with how famous this artist is, how famous Uzumaki is, and how it continues to be adapted even now, that the only ever official game adaptations are exclusive to WonderSwan. The first game, Denshi Kaikihen, is a sound novel, a format that works super well for WonderSwan and was initiated by Bandai's own novel theater game, Terrors. With the more mature office worker audience the device was known to have at this point, I can guess that this game was made just for those guys, and it's pretty revolutionary, all things considered, to have a computer-esque VN on a handheld from the late 90s. Truly, I don't know if the world ever saw anything like this before. The high-ish resolution of the screen allowing for readable text and detailed illustrations the likes of which could never be done on Game Boy. And it stands out as something that nonchalantly makes perfect use of the hardware. The second Uzumaki WonderSwan game, Noroi Simulation, is rough for me to grasp since it's a totally untranslated adventure game, but I think you play as the Spiral Curse and take control in terrorizing this town as the events of the manga unfold. Even if this one's a little harder to get into, it's just wild that we got 2 entire games based on Uzumaki and they're only on here. As mentioned, the rest of the year was a little slow for WonderSwan games, but it still got stuff like the first of many One Piece tie-in games, a port of Pocket Fighter, a port of Lode Runner, and another unprecedented horror tie-in sound novel with Ring Infinity from the same devs behind Terrors. One of only 2 games based on the Ring series, with the other being Terror's Realm on Dreamcast.
Meg, what's going on over there? Like, hey man, what's happening here?
Terror's Realm on Dreamcast. Terror's Realm on Dreamcast. It's pretty funny how the WonderSwan never got anything like Resident Evil or Silent Hill, but instead it got hit with 2 of Japan's biggest horror properties alongside original exclusive sound novels, and also Clock Tower. I can't imagine the WonderSwan was doing too great for the rest of the year despite this, with Bandai already putting resources into a successor and the lack of audience-grabbing releases. Not to mention the looming presence of Nintendo, who were getting ready for the next generation of their Game Boy line. That advanced Game Boy finally got revealed in August, and not long after Bandai showed off the WonderSwan Color at Tokyo Game Show, so the 2 companies were now pretty much direct rivals. In Japan. The WonderSwan Color was set to launch later that year in December 2000, and with it came an impressive get for Bandai. Demos were shown at Tokyo Game Show for this little-known role-playing game, Final Fantasy. Returning viewers will know that Square were up to all kinds of nonsense around this point in time. Final Fantasy X was set to release along with the first online game in the series later down the line, and Final Fantasy IX just released and
The Bouncer
was about to release at the end of the year, and development on a collaborative project with Disney was well underway. Through the generation that had just passed, Square made big bucks exclusively on PlayStation games. In giving up on Nintendo, they also gave up on handheld games, but it was only a matter of time before they made up or something else came along first, and, well, something else did come along first. I didn't really make a big enough deal out of it, but the original WonderSwan launch title, Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon, was the first to bring Square back into handheld games. Bandai took this partnership so seriously that they made a deal to keep Square making games for WonderSwan to prevent them from, God forbid, developing for Nintendo again. This newfound partnership resulted in the Color model's main launch title a year and a half later, the big boy game that would cement the WonderSwan line as pretty cool for its time for what it's worth. Final Fantasy, the first game in the series, portable for the very first time, only on WonderSwan. If there was gonna be a system seller, something to further its reputation as the PlayStation's Game Boy and provide a first-grade RPG experience, it would be this, yeah. Needless to say, this was received overwhelmingly well for Bandai, folks lining up to pick up the Final Fantasy WonderSwan bundle that included this gorgeous model variant decorated with logo insignia, shoving the device into luxury product status, even just for a moment. It was kinda like the FM Towns mod. The reality is that this was kinda WonderSwan's last chance, pulling out all the stops before it was too late, ahead of the Game Boy Advance. If it released any later or without such third-party endorsement, I imagine it would have lost relevance in the wake of the new generation. Either way, with the heavy-hitting Final Fantasy port came a few Bandai-published exclusives, like an upgraded color version of Gunpei and in another pretty blatant attempt to capture the PlayStation audience, coinciding with the Final Fantasy port is a rhythm game from none other than Nana Onsha. Put simply, Nana Onsha is Masaya Matsuda's company, the ones who developed PaRappa the Rapper, which became one of many defining exclusives for PlayStation. We probably wouldn't have Beatmania without it, though Beatmania and the Bimani team's other seminal music games took what Matsuda started and sharpened it into a clearly defined arcade format, revolving around perfect input timing rather than the under-the-hood musical instrument nature PaRappa had. Due to the explosion of those arcade rhythm games though, follow-ups to PaRappa like Jammer Lammy and Vib-ribbon suffered commercially, though Nana Onsha's games still remain influential on an entire genre. As I mentioned earlier, the company's first game was in fact released for Bandai's Pippin console. Tuning Glue, the Toshio Iwai-esque digital music toy, laid the foundations for PaRappa the Rapper's gameplay. Since Matsuda already worked under Sony's music label, Nana Onsha mainly made PlayStation games at the time, but the overlapping relationship both companies had with Bandai paid off for a Nana Onsha rhythm game to come to WonderSwan. Rhyme Rider Kerorikan, the first handheld game Wait, let me turn that a little. Rhyme Rider Kerorikan, the first handheld game from Nana Onsha, is a strong technical showcase for the handheld. The game makes use of all its features, from its enhanced color display to its audio capabilities to its unique button layout, for an experience undeniably unique to the WonderSwan. It could technically be done elsewhere, and it practically was done elsewhere with Vib-ribbon having the same gameplay format, but it's a game that screams WonderSwan in every capacity. It proves that Bandai's measured approach to the WonderSwan color launch paid off, at least a little, showing us what the platform could continue to be. I can't deny that Rhyme Rider Kerorikan is what got me interested in looking at the WonderSwan to begin with. If it wasn't there to initiate my curiosity of a whole platform that gets minimal discussion, I probably wouldn't have made the steps to begin researching the thing. I mentioned Rhyme Rider in my video on the Size CD-ROM game during my bloated coverage of every Nana Onsha game, but to find that it was at the forefront of the entire console launch along with Final Fantasy gives it considerably more weight than if it was just randomly put out in the middle of its lifespan. It's a Bandai House special on the same pedestal as Gunpei, but it was sort of the last of its kind on the device. Unfortunately, when it comes to what I'd like to cover at least, there wasn't a whole lot more after the WonderSwan Colors launch that stood out. The first half of 2001 was worryingly light, dotted with some sort of noteworthy releases. Guilty Gear Petite, a game I literally beat by repeating the same input over and over. Space Battleship Yamato, an unlikely but mediocre strategy game based on the influential anime. SD Gundam, Eiyuden Kishi and Musha Densetsu, Bandai's first try at doing the thing Pokemon did, but with standard definition Gundam. One of this half's most noteworthy titles was a Bandai-published port of the classic computer RPG Wizardry. Were I any good at classic computer RPGs, I would have had more to say about how fascinating and rich something like Wizardry is for the WonderSwan, but the original trilogy kind of saw Game Boy Color ports all simultaneously released just 1 week before the WonderSwan version. and the subsequent games in that trilogy were never brought over. It's cool that Bandai were trying to get RPGs on board to begin with, the genre defining WonderSwan's later years, but I can't imagine they were properly capturing the RPG crowd without Dragon Quest, a fact that doomed WonderSwan Color to be second best as the very day it launched. Dragon Quest III for Game Boy Color had just come out. So something about this project that's been tough for me to get around is that there's a lot of games on this thing. As in, more than I anticipated, and a whole lot more than I thought I'd actually play. I want to give this thing a chance to see how it can stand on its own and bring forth what makes it special, but it's really difficult to do so without just saying it's like the Game Boy. Because to many of us, it is just a Game Boy that Nintendo didn't make. Nintendo didn't make it, so it's a commercial failure, a niche product. The kind of thing that we take one look at and go, wow, what a hidden gem, only because it's hidden underneath the insurmountable reputation of its market rival. Dragon Quest III's portable Game Boy port releasing just a day before WonderSwan Color and its Final Fantasy I port is the perfect showcase of how Nintendo's shadow loomed over Bandai. Dragon Quest III is one of Japan's most popular RPGs ever made, and it naturally made a killing because it's Dragon Quest. The two handhelds could coexist, but I'll remind you that Bandai didn't have an in-house development team and relied solely on third parties, licensing agreements, and Koto. They put out a lot of games, but I'm having a hard time finding what to say about them. I thought it'd be easy to cover quote-unquote every game on the WonderSwan for you, but I have to go through this library myself, picking and choosing the games that I find interesting. It's a balancing act between telling the history of the platform while indulging in what I enjoy, and that's made hard when I'm into so much of what's available on the WonderSwan. To see this rich buffet of video games laid out in front of me is pretty overwhelming because I want to try it all, I want to see everything on the platform, and it's led to the WonderSwan being a microcosm of how I feel in regards to the overall medium. There are a lot of games I want to play, a lot of games I see in videos or messages or screenshots or articles and go, damn, that would be good to sink into, and then I simply can't do it. Not all of them. I could be playing Dragon Quest instead. Playing every WonderSwan game the way a YouTube channel trying to get your attention might claim to do so is not the intention of the product, not the WonderSwan or any platform, and it's definitely impossible to play every game ever made, so I just choose one or two games at a time regardless of how many I may have access to. I surf the waves of video games. Seeing the variety this deep ocean holds is important to me, but too often all I can do is just watch someone else talk about it. I've spent so much of my life investigating these things, but I'm still constantly learning. I'm a window shopper. I feel this way about the WonderSwan because it manages to contain so much despite its limited time on the market and dwindling variety in its later years. It's kind of impossible to cover everything, but I can give a rough overview, I can share my feelings, and most importantly, I can tell you what it left behind. Earlier in the year 2000, a piece of non-game WonderSwan software was put out named Tenori On. This came from music engineer Toshio Iwai, who previously designed the Famicom game Otoki and the Maxis PC game SimTunes. Iwai later said that Tenori On was designed with the genes of Gunpei Yokoi, as well as his earlier cancelled Super Nintendo progenitor of SimTunes, Sound Fantasy. You've got to understand that Tenori On is one of the coolest things I've ever seen. When Masaya Matsuura made Tune & Glue, the Pippin exclusive music sample toy, I don't know if you would have foreseen software that turns a portable game device into an instrument. Tenori On is the natural progression of the philosophy Tune & Glue puts forward, while the entire rhythm game genre that PaRappa the Rapper pioneered is a branch into a totally different direction. All this is to say, Tenori On comes as a shock to me. It's homebrew WonderSwan software that later became a real Yamaha instrument, solidifying itself as possibly the most influential thing on the device, all without Bandai's involvement. The real WonderSwan lies within this attitude. The real WonderSwan is for the people, and in late 2000, the WonderSwan's gates were opened up with the release of Cute Corporation's Wonder Witch. Back in 1996, Sony released the Net Yarose development kit, an expensive, souped-up PlayStation that let people create their own games for the console. I'm restraining myself from going too in-depth on this topic because of a future project I may or may not be working on, but if you know what this is, you'll probably find the Wonder Witch pretty familiar because it is, in essence, the WonderSwan's Net Yarose. It officially allowed anyone to program and play homebrew WonderSwan games through sharing them online, resulting in some of the platform's best titles, if I'm being honest. Like, you know how the WonderSwan can be tilted? You know how that'd be perfect for arcade shooters, a genre that constantly makes use of vertical aspect ratios? You know how I haven't mentioned a single vertical shooter yet? That's because, and I'm not kidding, the only vertical shooters on a handheld whose whole gimmick is that it has a built-in Tate mode are Wonder Witch games. Since this is a defunct product with documentation I can't read, I don't actually know the extent of this scene, how games were shared, or how many games were made with it, or how it even worked. But thanks to the Internet Archive, I've got access to at least a handful, and I do know that Cute Corporation held annual Grand Prix contests that led to official retail publishing of the games Dicing Knight and Judgment Silversword. My feelings on the WonderSwan being a microcosm of the wider game market extend here, because independent developers are the only ones truly keeping old platforms alive, and the WonderSwan was ahead of its time. Ahead of its own time, by letting these developers breathe life into an otherwise doomed device. In just a few years, the WonderSwan had its life, its death, and its resurgence, all simultaneous with each other. I don't even know how that happens. In 2002, Bandai put out the Swan Crystal, the WonderSwan's final model revision, and only a year later the whole line was discontinued. It saw a ton of licensed games, a ton of RPGs, and interestingly, 2 games licensed out by Sony Computer Entertainment. The seed planted by Sony's moderate collaboration with Bandai on the WonderSwan grew into the PlayStation Portable, announced at E3 2003 not long before the Swan Crystal's discontinuation.
There's going to be a new baby within the family.
The PSP was hardly the WonderSwan 2, but the WonderSwan does feel like a spiritual prototype for the PSP in more than a few ways. Not long after, Nintendo revealed their DS, which eventually replaced the Game Boy line entirely and brought about a new generation of handheld rivalry. Bandai's final WonderSwan game was Dragon Ball, the only Dragon Ball game on the whole thing, and the final releases were the aforementioned retail versions of Judgment Silversword and Dicing Knight. In 2006, Bandai forcibly became part of video games for good once the company merged with Namco, forever glued together as a result of some kind of economic difficulty that swept the nation's game industry and resulted in other mergers like those of Koei Tecmo and Square Enix. Under the new Bandai Namco name, Gunpei was given another chance on DS and PSP via Q Entertainment of Lumines fame. Judgment Silversword and its counterpart Cardinal Sins both came to modern platforms with a re-release of the developer M. Kai's later Xbox 360 game Eschatos. So even though Bandai has done nothing to revive the WonderSwan, you can still play 2 of its best games right now. You can also play Gunpei. I really think you should play Gunpei. The PSP version of Gunpei is really good. By the way, the WonderSwan never got any Kamen Rider games.
思ってたっとしとなーす。アスカは行きなさい。
それも命令。
ここにはいない。目下家出中。そうなら探してみる。
教えといてあげる。私たちエヴァパイロットはエヴァ同様人の枠を超えないよう設計時に抑制されてる。